My name is Amelia Sterling, and for 36 years, I believed that being a good daughter was my primary purpose. It was a role I had rehearsed my whole life, a script I had memorized until the lines were etched into my very soul. I dedicated myself to earning the approval of my mother, Eleanor, a woman whose love felt like a distant, glittering prize I could see but never quite grasp. That's why I found myself standing in the amber-hued private dining room of the Gilded Vine, one of Chicago's most revered restaurants, fussing with the placement of a single white peony in a crystal vase. Everything had to be perfect for her 70th birthday. The string quartet in the corner was tuning their instruments, the soft, discordant notes a perfect mirror of the anxiety tightening in my chest. I had curated the guest list, chosen a menu of her favorite seasonal dishes, and spent a small fortune on the evening. When Eleanor raised her glass for a toast later that night, I imagined her eyes would finally fill with the warmth and gratitude I had spent a lifetime trying to kindle. Instead, when that moment came, she looked directly at me, her gaze as cool and unyielding as the Chicago winter ice on Lake Michigan, and said, "As I enter this new decade, my greatest wish is for simplicity. To be free from burdens. The most profound gift anyone could give me is the freedom of their absence." She couldn't have known how literally, how completely, I would take those words to heart. Before I tell you the story of how I vanished from my mother's life, I suppose you need to understand the architecture of our history, the foundation upon which my world shattered that night. My childhood memories are not of bedtime stories and scraped knees kissed better, but of a constant, low hum of correction. Eleanor's love was conditional, a currency I never seemed to have enough of. My drawings were never neat enough, the colors always slightly outside the lines. My report cards, filled with A's, were always met with a sigh and a comment about the daughter of a friend who had secured a more impressive award. While other mothers adorned their refrigerators with clumsy, joyful childhood art, mine would hold my efforts up to the light, point out the imperfections, and then file them away in a box labeled Amelia's Things, a tomb for my inadequate best efforts. "Straighten your shoulders, Amelia. A lady does not slouch," she would murmur, her fingers digging into my back in the middle of a department store. "Smile, but not so widely. It crinkles your eyes." These endless adjustments became the soundtrack of my youth, a constant reminder that I was a project in need of perpetual renovation. My father, Marcus, was the opposite. He was my warmth, my quiet champion. He smelled of old books and sawdust from his workshop in the garage. "There's my brilliant girl," he would say, his eyes crinkling at the corners in a way my mother disdained, as I showed him a short story I had written or a clay bird I had sculpted. He was the buffer, the soft place to land after a collision with my mother's rigid expectations. He saw the girl I was, not the woman she was trying to mold me into. But when I was 14, that buffer was stolen from me. My father died of a sudden, catastrophic brain aneurysm. He had been complaining of a headache, and I'd told him to lie down while Mom was at her weekly book club meeting. I found him collapsed on the floor of his study an hour later. I remember the keening sound that came out of my own throat, the disembodied feeling of calling 911, the flashing red and blue lights painting frantic strokes across our quiet suburban street. At the hospital, after the doctor delivered the news with quiet finality, my mother's first words to me were not of comfort, but of accusation. "He said he had a headache. Why didn't you make him go to the doctor? You should have noticed he was acting strangely." Those words, whispered in the sterile, antiseptic air of the waiting room, planted a seed of guilt so deep it felt like part of my own DNA. In the narrative my mother constructed out of her grief, I became an unwitting accomplice in my own father's death. It was a silent, insidious accusation she would nurture in me for the next 2 decades. My teenage years unfolded as a frantic quest for an approval that remained forever out of reach. I was the president of the Honor Society, the editor of the school paper, captain of the debate team. Each accolade was met with a lukewarm, "That's nice, dear," before she would mention a classmate who had achieved something slightly more prestigious. Despite her profound lack of encouragement, I earned a full academic scholarship to the University of Chicago. When I showed her the acceptance letter, her face barely registered a flicker of pride. That's a very difficult school, Amelia, she said, folding the letter neatly and placing it on the hall table. You'll probably find yourself overwhelmed. I did not find myself overwhelmed. I graduated summa cum laude with a degree in marketing and communications. My mother did not attend the ceremony. She claimed a sudden migraine had confined her to a darkened room. My personal life was where her influence was most destructive. At 24, I started dating Liam, a kind, steady architect with a gentle laugh who my friends adored. The first time he came for dinner at my mother's apartment, she spent the evening weaving a tapestry of my inadequacies, all disguised as maternal anecdotes. Amelia was always so terribly shy, she told him over dessert, patting his hand. It's a wonder she managed to catch a handsome man like you. A few weeks later, she called him. I only found out about it after he had broken things off, explaining that he wasn't ready for someone with so many unresolved family issues. My mother had, in her words, simply warned him about my emotional fragility. This pattern of sabotage repeated itself with a musician at 27 and a professor at 30. Each time, just as I began to feel a sense of happiness and stability, my mother would find a way to dismantle it. I'm only protecting you, she would say, her voice laced with false concern. You have your father's trusting nature. You simply don't have good judgment when it comes to men. Despite it all, I built a life. I channeled my relentless need to achieve into my career, rising through the ranks at a prestigious Chicago marketing firm. By 36, I was a senior executive, managing major national campaigns. I bought a beautiful condo in Lincoln Park with sweeping views of the city skyline. I had created, on the surface, a life of success and stability. And through it all, I supported my mother. After my father died, she declared herself incapable of working, living off his life insurance and then his pension. When that money began to thin, I stepped in without question. I paid the exorbitant rent on her fashionable River North apartment, covered her utilities, funded her memberships to various social clubs, and paid off her credit card bills without ever looking too closely at the charges. Every Sunday, I would drive to her apartment, listen to her complain about the noisy neighbors, her ungrateful friends, and, most frequently, me. It was a penance I paid for a crime I hadn't committed. For her 70th birthday, I decided to make one last, grand attempt. A gesture so significant it would have to break through her wall of criticism. I commissioned a portrait of her from a renowned local artist, working from a photograph of her in her early 20s, vibrant and full of life. It was a version of her I had only ever seen in pictures, before bitterness had carved its fine lines into her face. The portrait was my attempt to show her how I wanted to see her, how my father had seen her. It was an impossibly expensive and deeply personal gift, my final, desperate bid for her love. This time will be different, I told my therapist, Dr. Allen, the week before the party. I think this will finally show her how much she means to me. He offered a gentle, non-committal smile, but his eyes held a familiar concern. Deep down, I knew I was walking willingly into the path of a coming storm. But hope, I've learned, is a stubborn and often foolish thing. The evening of my mother's birthday, the gilded vine was bathed in a warm, forgiving light. The private room was a symphony of understated elegance. Massive bouquets of white peonies, her favorite, perfumed the air. A string quartet played softly in the corner, their melody weaving a sense of gentle anticipation through the room. I had arrived an hour early, my heart a frantic hummingbird in my chest, to oversee every last detail. Your mother must be a very special woman, the restaurant manager said with a kind smile as he adjusted a candle. She is, I replied, the words tasting like a lie I had told so often it had become my truth. The guests, my mother's carefully curated collection of friends, began to arrive, greeting me with air kisses and compliments. Amelia, this is just exquisite. Your mother is so fortunate to have you, one of them, a woman named Beatrice, cooed. I smiled, a polite, brittle expression I had perfected over years of practice. At 7:15, my mother made her entrance. She was wearing a deep emerald silk dress I had bought for her, her silver hair styled in a perfect chignon. I moved forward to embrace her, but she turned her head at the last second, offering me her powdered cheek instead. "The traffic was simply awful," were her first words, her eyes scanning the room with a critical sweep. "And this music is a bit somber, don't you think? It sounds like a funeral." "I can ask them to play something more upbeat," I offered, my voice too eager. "No, no, don't fuss," she sighed, waving a dismissive hand. "It's fine. Who chose the flowers? Peonies give me a headache." They had been her favorite for my entire life. I had memories of her planting them in our garden, her hands covered in soil, one of the few times I'd seen her truly content. I said nothing. I simply signaled to the waiter to bring her a glass of her preferred Sancerre. The dinner progressed as I should have expected. Eleanor, my mother, was the radiant star, holding court at the center of the table, regaling her friends with stories. She barely acknowledged me, except to ask me to tell the waiter that her sea bass was slightly overcooked, though I could see it was flaky and perfect, just as she'd requested. After the main course, before dessert was to be served, I stood up. It was time for the gift. The easel holding the portrait stood shrouded in velvet cloth. "Mom," I began, my voice trembling slightly. "For your 70th birthday, I wanted to give you something truly special. Something to honor the beautiful woman you've always been." With a nod to the waiter, he pulled away the velvet cover. A collective gasp went through the room. The portrait was stunning. The artist had perfectly captured the light in her eyes, the hopeful curve of her young mouth. It was Eleanor before the world had disappointed her. The room was silent, waiting for her reaction. She stared at the painting for a long, cold moment. Then she turned away from it, her expression flat. "It makes me look old," she said, her voice cutting through the reverent hush. "And sentimental." The artist didn't capture my spirit at all. She gestured vaguely to a waiter. "Could you move this to the corner, please? It's rather distracting." The guests shifted uncomfortably. Beatrice reached out and touched my mother's arm. "Eleanor, it's a masterpiece. He's captured you perfectly." My mother simply took a sip of her wine, as if the matter was closed. My face burned with a familiar, hot shame as the waiter quietly moved the portrait, my grand gesture, to face the wall in a dark corner. When the cake arrived, a multi-layered confection glowing with 70 candles, everyone sang. My mother smiled for the benefit of her friends, a practiced, camera-ready smile. Then she stood to make a toast. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice resonating with theatrical warmth. "It means the world to be surrounded by my true friends on such a milestone birthday." She didn't look at me. As I get older, I find I value authenticity above all else. She raised her glass, her eyes finally swiveling to find mine across the table. The moment seemed to stretch, to slow down, the clinking of cutlery and quiet chatter fading into a dull roar in my ears. "If I were to wish for a gift this year," she continued, her voice clear and steady, her eyes locked on mine, "it would not be for jewels or paintings. As I enter this new decade, my greatest wish is for simplicity. To be free from burdens." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. "The most profound gift anyone could give me is the freedom of their absence. No more pretense, no more obligation. Just peace." The room fell into a stunned, absolute silence. Her friends stared at their plates, at the ceiling, anywhere but at me or my mother. There was no mistaking her meaning. It was a surgical strike, delivered with devastating precision. "To a new chapter," she finished, taking a delicate sip of her wine before sitting down, as if she had just commented on the weather. I sat there, frozen, a statue carved from humiliation. The drive to her apartment was a silent, suffocating ordeal. As I pulled up to her building, she gathered her things. "The dinner was adequate," she said, opening the car door. "But the gilded vine has really gone downhill." I couldn't stop myself. A dam of unspoken words broke inside me. "Did you mean it?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "What you said in your toast. About wanting me out of your life." She paused, one foot on the pavement, and sighed, a sound of pure exasperation. "Amelia, don't be so terribly dramatic. I was making a philosophical point." "It didn't feel philosophical, Mom. It felt personal. It felt like you were talking to me." Her face hardened in the glow of the dashboard lights. "Well, If you choose to take it that way, that's your prerogative. But yes, she added, her voice dropping to a colder, harder register, if I'm being honest, our relationship has always felt like a duty. I did my duty raising you. I am not obligated to pretend we have some deep, unbreakable bond now that you're grown. I pay your rent, I said, the words falling out of me, small and heavy. I pay for your entire life. I take care of everything. And you never let me forget it, do you? She snapped, her voice like a whip. You think that money buys you a place in my life? That's your father in you. Always keeping score. She slammed the car door shut, the sound echoing in the quiet street. I watched her walk into the opulent lobby of her apartment building without a single backward glance. I sat there in the silence of my car for a long time, the city lights blurring through the tears that streamed down my face. And in that moment, a fundamental, painful truth finally solidified in my mind. Nothing would ever be enough. No achievement, no sacrifice, no gift, no matter how thoughtful or expensive, would ever make my mother love me the way I needed to be loved. For 36 years, I had been running a marathon with no finish line, exhausting myself in the pursuit of an impossible prize. As the first hints of dawn began to soften the hard edges of the Chicago skyline, I made a decision. It was a quiet, cold, and absolute decision. A decision that would change both of our lives forever. Sleep was an impossibility that night. Instead, I sat at my sleek, modern dining table, a table I'd bought because my mother said it was appropriately sophisticated, with a yellow legal pad and a pen. As the sun rose, casting long shadows across my perfectly curated Lincoln Park condo, I didn't have tears left. I had a plan. A detailed, step-by-step strategy for honoring my mother's greatest wish. My first call was at 6 a.m. I left a calm, measured voicemail for my boss, explaining that a sudden family emergency required me to take an immediate, indefinite leave of absence. I had years of unused vacation time stockpiled, always too preoccupied with my mother's needs to ever truly take a break for myself. Next, I called a trusted realtor I'd worked with at my firm. Marcus, I said, my voice steady, I need to sell my condo. Immediately and privately. An off-market, cash-only sale. I don't care if I take a loss. I care about speed and discretion. Amelia, is everything all right? Are you in some kind of trouble? He asked, his voice thick with concern. No trouble, Marcus, I assured him. I'm just making a necessary change. By noon, I was in the glass-walled office of my financial advisor, a meticulous man named David Chin. I had a binder with me, every account, every asset, every financial thread that connected me to Eleanor neatly tabulated. I need to financially decouple myself from my mother, I explained, sliding the binder across his desk. Completely. Every automatic payment, every joint account, every beneficiary designation. David looked at the documents, his eyebrows rising slightly. This is comprehensive, Amelia. You're covering her rent, her club memberships, 3 credit cards, insurance. Yes, I said. And as of today, it all stops. May I ask what brought this on? He asked gently. It's time for us both to stand on our own feet, I said, the phrase feeling both liberating and terrifying. We spent the next 3 hours methodically dismantling the financial scaffolding that had supported my mother for over a decade. I closed the joint account I used for her expenses. I canceled every recurring payment. I had my name removed from her credit cards and, most significantly, I changed the beneficiary on my life insurance policy and my substantial retirement accounts from her name to my father's sister, my Aunt Carol. What about the lease on her apartment? David asked. You co-signed it. She will have to manage that with her landlord, I said, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. The responsibility is hers now. From David's office, I went to a UPS store and opened a private mailbox. I filled out a change of address form online, redirecting all my mail there. I spent the rest of the afternoon on the phone, a grimly efficient agent of my own disappearance. I canceled the premium cable package I paid for at her apartment, the weekly grocery delivery service, the car service account she used. I was methodical, leaving no loose threads, no financial lifelines that could pull me back into her orbit. Back at my condo, I began to pack. Not everything, just the things that were truly mine. My father's collection of vintage sci-fi novels, my college journals, a small box of photographs. I packed a suitcase of simple clothes. As I moved through the rooms, I was struck by how little I cared for the beautiful, expensive objects that filled them. The abstract painting my mother had approved of, the designer sofa that was beautiful but uncomfortable, the formal dinnerware I had never used. It was all a stage set for a life that wasn't my own. I decided to sell it all with the condo. That evening, I wrote my mother a letter. It took several drafts to distill my storm of emotions into something calm and final. Eleanor, last night, you said the greatest gift you could receive was the freedom of my absence. I have decided to give you that gift. By the time you read this, all the financial support I have provided over the years will have ceased. The responsibility for your rent, your bills, and all other expenses is now your own. I have untangled our lives in every way I know how. This is not an act of anger, but one of acceptance. You are right. Our relationship has been built on a foundation of obligation, not genuine affection. I am releasing us both from that obligation. Please do not try to find me. I need to build a life for myself on my own terms. I wish you peace. Amelia. I sealed the letter and drove to her building late that night. I handed the envelope to the night doorman, a man whose face I knew from years of dropping her off. For Eleanor Sterling, I said, and walked away without looking back. That night, I checked into a nondescript hotel near the airport, paying in cash. As I sat on the edge of the generic, stiff bed, a wave of emotions washed over me, grief so sharp it felt like a physical wound, but also a profound, exhilarating lightness. For the first time in my conscious memory, I was not responsible for Eleanor's happiness. The weight of that lifelong burden lifting from my shoulders was so immense I gasped aloud in the silent room. The next week was a blur of logistics. Marcus found a buyer for my condo, an investor willing to pay cash for a quick closing, 20% below market value. It was a price I gladly paid for my freedom. I opened new bank accounts at a different bank, deactivated my social media, and got a new phone number, giving it only to Aunt Carol, my boss, and my therapist. With my essential belongings packed in my car, I drove west, away from the city's familiar skyline. I had no destination in mind, only a direction, away. Each mile I put between myself and Chicago felt like a stitch being removed from a wound. The guilt was a constant companion, a phantom limb aching for the familiar weight of responsibility. But beneath it, a tiny, fragile current of something new was beginning to flow, possibility. I had disappeared completely from my mother's life. What I didn't realize then was that in doing so, I had also disappeared from my own. The Amelia who existed only in relation to her mother, the dutiful, anxious, approval-seeking daughter, was gone. Who would take her place was a question I was both terrified and thrilled to answer. The first ripples of my disappearance reached my mother about a week after I left Chicago. The messages, which Aunt Carol would later recount to me in our carefully scheduled, brief phone calls, started as commands, not queries. They came to my old email address and as voicemails on my disconnected phone. Amelia, the club membership payment was declined. See to it at once. The landlord called about the rent. I don't know why you're late, but it's embarrassing. Fix this. Where are you? My grocery order didn't arrive. She never mentioned my letter. It was as if she had simply refused to process it. In her mind, the world had made a clerical error, and I, her ever-efficient daughter, was required to correct it. 10 days after I left, she showed up at my old office. My former assistant, a kind young woman named Chloe, emailed my new, private address later that day. Hi Amelia, I hope you're okay. Your mother was here today. She was very upset, demanding to know where you were. She caused quite a scene in the lobby, and security had to ask her to leave. I replied with a short message, thanking her for letting me know but offering no explanation. 2 weeks in, the first official eviction notice was posted on the door of her expensive River North apartment. According to Aunt Carol, this was the first true crack in my mother's armor of denial. She had never had to deal with a landlord, never had to write a rent check. For years, money had simply appeared in the account, and the bills had simply been paid. The machinery of her life, which she had taken for granted, had ground to a halt. Social media became her next theater of operations. Though I had deleted my accounts, friends sent me screenshots. Her posts evolved from passive-aggressive to openly dramatic. Worried about my beloved daughter, Amelia. No one has heard from her in weeks, she wrote initially. This morphed into, my daughter has vanished, leaving her elderly mother all alone. After everything I sacrificed for her. If anyone knows where she is, please tell her to come home. A chorus of sympathy rose from her social circle, a digital Greek chorus lamenting the tragedy of the ungrateful child. A month after I left, the reality of her financial situation began to set in. She went to the bank to complain about the closed joint account, only to be told that the funds had been mine and were no longer available to her. She made a terrible scene, Aunt Carol reported, her voice weary. She told the bank manager that she had no money, that you handled all of that. They suggested she look into her pension and Social Security benefits. She didn't even know how to access them. My mother, who had lived a life of leisure and luxury, was forced to confront the fact that she was not wealthy. My father's pension was modest. Combined with her Social Security, it was enough for a safe, simple life, but not enough to sustain the lifestyle of a River North socialite. Her credit cards, all of which were carrying substantial balances that I had been paying down, were now her sole responsibility. When the sold sign went up in front of my Lincoln Park condo building, she drove there in a panic, only to be met by the new owners, a young couple who knew nothing about me. The last pillar of her belief that this was all a temporary misunderstanding had crumbled. 2 months in, she received a formal notice of eviction. Her credit card debt had ballooned to over $50,000. It was during this period that she had her first serious health crisis. Aunt Carol found her on the floor of her half-packed apartment, gasping for breath, in the throes of a severe anxiety attack. At the hospital, her blood pressure was dangerously high. The doctors diagnosed her with stress-induced hypertension. She kept asking for you, Amelia, Aunt Carol told me on the phone. Not in a demanding way. For the first time, she sounded scared. Worried about you, not just about what you could do for her. It was shortly after this that my mother moved out of her apartment. With Aunt Carol's reluctant help, she sold her designer furniture and clothes at a consignment shop for a fraction of their original price. She used the money to pay the first month's rent on a small, government-subsidized senior apartment in a quiet, unassuming suburb far from the glittering city center she had called home. 3 months after my disappearance, she wrote me a letter. Aunt Carol forwarded it to my P.O. box in Portland. The envelope was plain, her usually perfect, looping handwriting now shaky and thin. I let it sit on my kitchen counter for a week before I had the courage to open it. Amelia, I have spent these past months being furious with you. I told everyone who would listen that you had abandoned me. Yesterday, I was unpacking a box and found that old photo album, the one with pictures from your childhood. The one I never looked at. I saw your face at your 5th birthday party, at your middle school graduation. And I saw something in your eyes that I never let myself see before. I saw how hard you were trying. And I saw how sad you were. I was not a good mother to you. I know that now. After your father died, I think I hated you a little bit for being young and having your whole life ahead of you, while mine felt like it was over. I was jealous of how much he adored you. I blamed you for his death because it was easier than blaming myself. None of this is an excuse for how I treated you. I am not writing to ask for money or for you to come back. My life is very different now. I am learning to live on what I have. I am finally learning to be responsible for myself. I understand why you left. I drove you to it. I just wanted to say that I am sorry. Truly sorry. Mom. The letter contained no demands, no manipulations, no subtle barbs of guilt. It was a simple, stark admission. For the first time in my 36 years, my mother had seen me not as an extension of herself or a solution to her problems, but as a separate person whose pain was real and valid. A few weeks later, Aunt Carol sent another update. My mother had joined a support group. She was seeing a therapist. She was learning to cook for herself, to budget her small income, to navigate the bus system. On her 71st birthday, exactly 1 year after the dinner at the Gilded Vine, Aunt Carol sent me a photo. It was of my mother, sitting alone in her small, neat apartment with a single cupcake and a lit candle. She told Carol it was the first birthday where she truly understood the magnitude of what she had lost. Not the money, not the apartment, not the lifestyle. Just me. While Eleanor's world was shrinking and then slowly being rebuilt on a new foundation, mine was quietly, cautiously expanding. After weeks of aimless driving, I had found myself drawn to the gentle, persistent rain and lush greenery of Portland, Oregon. It was as far from the steel and glass canyons of Chicago as I could get, and its quiet, understated beauty felt like a balm to my frayed nerves. I found a small apartment in the Pearl District, in a converted warehouse with high ceilings and large windows that looked out over a perpetually damp, green courtyard. Unlike my Chicago condo, which had been furnished to impress, this space became a sanctuary built purely for my own comfort. I filled it with secondhand books, cozy blankets in shades of blue and green, and dozens of plants. There was no formal dining room, no guest room designed for visitors I never had. It was a space that felt like me. With my credentials and experience, I found a position at a small, community-focused marketing agency. The firm specialized in promoting nonprofits and ethical businesses. The work was less glamorous, the pay less extravagant, but the culture was one of collaboration and mutual respect. We want people who are passionate about making a positive impact, not just about climbing the ladder, my new boss, a woman named Sarah, told me in my interview. The simple humanity of that statement nearly brought me to tears. My next priority was finding a new therapist. I found Dr. Anya Sharma, a warm, insightful woman who specialized in complex family trauma. In our first session, I recounted the story of my departure, my voice shaking, expecting the gentle suggestion to try to understand my mother's perspective that I had grown used to. Instead, Dr. Sharma looked at me with profound empathy and said, "Amelia, you didn't sever a relationship. You saved yourself. Estrangement is not a failure. Sometimes, it's a necessary act of survival." Hearing that validation was like a key turning in a lock I didn't even know was there. It gave me permission to finally stop punishing myself for choosing to live. Making friends was a challenge. In Chicago, my social life had been an extension of my work or my mother's circle. In Portland, I had to learn to build connections from scratch, based on nothing but shared interests and mutual liking. I joined a pottery class, where I learned the messy, grounding art of shaping clay. I joined a hiking group, exploring the misty trails of the Columbia River Gorge. Slowly, tentatively, I built a small circle of friends who knew me only as Amelia, the woman who loved old movies and made slightly lopsided coffee mugs. These friendships, free from the weight of history and obligation, were a revelation. 6 months into my new life, at a friend's casual backyard barbecue, I met Ben. He was a high school history teacher with kind, crinkling eyes, the same way my father's used to, and a quiet, self-deprecating sense of humor. We talked for hours about everything and nothing. When he asked for my number, I felt a surge of my old fear, the instinct to retreat before I could be hurt. But I gave it to him anyway, a small act of courage that felt monumental. Our relationship was unlike any I had ever known. There was no game playing, no pressure, no performance. We went on long, rambling walks in the rain, spent hours in dusty bookstores, and cooked simple meals in my small kitchen. It was easy. It was calm. Meeting his family was like stepping into an alternate universe. They were a loud, loving, chaotic group who argued about politics over dinner, hugged fiercely, and expressed their affection openly and without strings attached. The first time his mother, a woman with a booming laugh and flour on her apron, pulled me into a hug, I went completely rigid with shock before awkwardly patting her on the back. "Your family is so wonderfully normal," I told Ben later, the words feeling inadequate. "They're nuts," he laughed. "But yeah, they're pretty great." A year into my new life, just after receiving my mother's first letter, I had a breakthrough in therapy. Dr. Sharma asked me to write a letter to my 14-year-old self, the girl who stood in the hospital hallway shouldering the blame for her father's death. "Dear Amelia," I wrote, the tears dripping onto the page. "It was never your fault. It was not your job to save him. It was not your job to make your mother happy. Her sadness is not your burden to carry. You were a good daughter. You were and are worthy of love, exactly as you are. Reading those words aloud in Dr. Sharma's office, I felt a deep, foundational shift within me. For the first time, I wasn't just saying the words, I was beginning to believe them. When I showed Ben my mother's letter, he read it carefully and then just held my hand. "What do you want to do?" he asked. Not, "You should forgive her," or "It's about time," but a simple, respectful question that centered my feelings. "I don't know yet," I whispered. And for the first time, not knowing felt okay. I was no longer on a frantic timeline, desperate for a resolution. I was on my own time. A year after leaving Chicago, I was a different woman. I was quieter, perhaps, but stronger. My life was smaller in scale, but infinitely richer in substance. I had a job I cared about, friends I trusted, and a man I was falling in love with, slowly and safely. I had walked out of the wreckage of my old life and, brick by brick, had begun to build a home within myself. And from that safe place, I finally began to consider the possibility of what might come next, not with my old, desperate hope, but with a new, clear-eyed curiosity. 2 years after I drove away from Chicago, I flew back. A major industry conference was being held there, and my boss had insisted I attend. Ben offered to come, his presence a steady anchor I could hold on to, but I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that this was a journey I had to make alone. I didn't tell my mother I was coming. The idea of a pre-planned reunion, with its heavy cloak of expectation, was more than I could bear. I checked into a hotel in the Loop and spent the first day just walking, reacquainting myself with a city that felt like a past life. I walked past my old office, the gleaming tower now just another building on the skyline. I took a cab through Lincoln Park and glanced at the window of my old condo, now home to strangers. These places, once the cornerstones of my identity, now felt like a well-preserved museum of a person I no longer was. The next day, I had tea with my Aunt Carol. At 75, she was still sharp, her gaze missing nothing. "She's changed, Amelia," she told me, her teacup rattling softly in its saucer. "Don't get me wrong, she's still Eleanor. But there's a quietness to her now. The bitterness has softened." "Do you think I should see her?" I asked, the question I'd been avoiding for 2 years. Carol looked at me for a long moment. "I think you should only see her if you want to. Not because you feel you should. But the woman who lives in that little apartment in Oak Park is not the same woman who gave that toast at her birthday party." I had no intention of seeing her. My plan was to finish the conference and fly back to the safety of my new life. But on my last afternoon, I found myself in a cab, giving the driver the address of her senior living complex. I parked across the street, telling myself I just wanted to see the building. As I sat there, my heart thrumming a nervous rhythm against my ribs, I saw her. She was walking slowly toward the entrance, carrying a canvas grocery bag. Her posture, once so rigidly upright, was now softer, slightly stooped. Before I could think, before I could lose my nerve, I got out of the car. We didn't have a dramatic, cinematic meeting. It happened in the most mundane of places, the small, slightly dated coffee shop attached to her building's community center. She was in line ahead of me, her back to me, ordering a decaf latte. She didn't recognize me. My hair was longer, my clothes were simpler, and the perpetual tension I used to carry in my shoulders was gone. It was only when the barista called my name for the coffee I'd just ordered that she turned. Her eyes widened, first in confusion, and then in dawning, shocked recognition. "Amelia?" Her voice was a wisp of sound. "Hello, Mom." We stood there for a frozen moment, the ordinary sounds of the coffee shop, the hiss of the milk steamer, the clink of ceramic, fading into the background. Are you all right?" she asked, and the genuine, unadorned concern in her voice was so foreign it nearly buckled my knees. "I am," I said. "Are you?" She nodded, her eyes never leaving my face. Would you sit with me?" For a minute. I hesitated, then gestured to a small, wobbly table by the window. We sat in an awkward silence, two strangers with a shared lifetime of history between them. "I didn't know you were in town," she said finally. "I didn't tell anyone but Carol." She nodded, accepting this. "You look well," she said. "Different. But good." "So do you," I replied, and I was surprised to find that I meant it. The harsh, critical lines around her mouth seemed to have softened. We talked about the weather, the coffee, the sorts of meaningless things people talk about when the meaningful things are too large to approach. Then, my mother did something I had never seen her do in my entire life. She began to cry. Not the dramatic, manipulative tears I had known in the past, but quiet, sorrowful tears that she tried to discreetly wipe away with a napkin. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice thick. "I truly never thought I would see you again." "I never thought I'd come back," I admitted quietly. "I understand why," she said. "I've had a lot of time to think. My therapist, she's helped me see things." She took a shaky breath. "I treated you the way my own mother treated me." This was new. My grandmother, who died when I was young, was always spoken of as a paragon of grace and strength. Grandma rose. My mother nodded, staring down at her hands, which were clasped tightly on the table. She was a deeply unhappy woman. And she was cruel. She told me I was her great disappointment. That I was plain and not clever enough. That I had married beneath me when I chose your father. Her voice cracked. "Does any of that sound familiar?" A chill went through me. "You never told me any of this." "I was ashamed," she said. "I thought it was my fault. When you were born, I swore I would be a different kind of mother. But I didn't know how. I only knew how to find fault. It was the only language of love I had ever been taught." She looked up at me, her eyes pleading for something I couldn't name. "It's an explanation, Amelia. It is not an excuse. Nothing excuses what I did. Especially after your father died. I resented you for having his love so easily. And I made you pay for it for 20 years. The raw honesty of her confession left me speechless. We sat in silence, the weight of it settling between us. Finally, she reached into her purse and pulled out a worn, leather-bound journal. "I started writing this after you left," she said, pushing it across the table toward me. "My therapist suggested it. It's all in there. My childhood. My marriage. My failures as a mother. You don't ever have to read it. But if you ever want to understand, it's there." I took the journal. Its weight felt significant in my hands. "I am not asking for your forgiveness," she said, her voice steady now. "And I'm not asking to be a part of your new life. I just needed you to know that I see it now. I see you. And I am so very sorry that I made you leave in order to do it." As we parted ways outside the coffee shop, there was no tearful embrace, no promise of a return to what we were. There was only a quiet, fragile sense of truth. "I live in Portland now," I told her. "I have a good life." A small, genuine smile touched her lips. "I'm glad, Amelia. That's all I should have ever wanted for you." "I can't promise anything," I said carefully. "But maybe we could email? Sometimes." Her eyes brightened with unshed tears. "I would like that," she said. "I would like that very much." On the plane back to Portland, I held the journal in my lap but didn't open it. Some stories, I knew, had to be read slowly and with support. Daniel met me at the airport, his calm presence a welcome shore after the turbulent emotional waters of the trip. "How did it go?" he asked simply, taking my bag. "It was nothing like I expected," I said, leaning my head against his shoulder as we walked. "And maybe, just maybe, better than I could have hoped." Another year has passed. My life in Portland continues to blossom in quiet, wonderful ways. Daniel and I were married last spring, a small ceremony in the Hoyt Arboretum, surrounded by towering trees and our closest friends. Ben's family has enfolded me into their warm, chaotic embrace, teaching me what unconditional love feels like in practice, not just in theory. I am now a partner at my firm, and I find deep satisfaction in my work. My mother came to the wedding. It was a decision I made after months of our careful, tentative email correspondence, which had slowly blossomed into occasional, brief phone calls. When I invited her, she cried softly and said she would only come if I was absolutely certain my day would be enhanced, not stressed, by her presence. Her consideration for my feelings, so starkly different from her old self-absorption, was the answer I needed. She was a quiet guest at the wedding. She watched the proceedings with a gentle, almost wistful expression. When Ben's mother showed her a photo of her newest grandchild, Eleanor didn't offer a critique or a comparison. She just said, "He has beautiful eyes." It was a small moment, but it felt like a miracle. We will never have a simple, easy relationship. The scars of our shared history are too deep. But we are building something new in the space between us. Something honest, something real. It is a relationship between two adults, forged in the painful fires of separation and self-reflection. The journal she gave me still sits on my bookshelf. I read it, piece by piece, with Dr. Sharma by my side. It was a painful, illuminating read, a map of another woman's pain that helped me, finally, to understand the landscape of my own. Looking back, I know that disappearing was the most loving thing I could have done for both of us. My presence was a crutch that prevented her from ever learning to walk on her own. My absence was the harsh, necessary catalyst for her change. It was only by leaving that I gave her the space to find a better version of herself. And it was only by leaving that I could finally do the same. Our story is not a fairy tale with a perfectly happy ending. But it is a true story. It's a story about how sometimes the most courageous act of love is to walk away. It's about how setting boundaries can save not one life, but two. And it's about the quiet, hopeful truth that it is never, ever too late to change. At my wedding, my mother, a woman who once used a toast to publicly exile me, raised a glass. Her hand trembled slightly, but her voice was clear. "To new beginnings," she said, looking directly at me, her eyes filled with a sad, beautiful, hard-won love. "And to the daughter who was brave enough to leave, so that we could both, finally, find our way home."